Beyond the Clock. The Untold Power of Null Time. By Elton Gar. My discovery of the null time field was largely accidental. I had been studying the side effects of a classified technology that had been developed by Sci-Fi Inc., a company most of you haven't heard of, but I assure you that you'll know who they are 5 years from now. But this isn't about them. It's about me and my failure to consider the ramifications. But even now, after so long dealing with the dangers, I can't imagine giving it up. The scientific nature of the null field is complicated, boring, and classified. I'm pushing the limits to say that you should think of it a bit like a refrigerator or an air conditioner. It doesn't so much create anything as it does separate it. With an air conditioner, you have cold air coming out one side and hot air on the others. With the null field, you have null time coming out one end, and that's more than I should say. You might assume I worked for Sci-Fi Inc. That would probably have made all of this easier in a number of ways. But as it is, I was given access by someone who would prefer to stay anonymous. I then used all of my savings to remodel my extra bedroom. It was a big bedroom with plenty of windows and a walk-in closet where I kept a few boxes of keepsakes from my first marriage. I had been using the room for storage for years, so all I had to do was trade out useless boxes with things I might use. Those things included a narrow but comfortable bed, a recliner, a small media center, a refrigerator, a microwave, a small bank of hard drives, and a few dozen oxygen bottles. My plan was to stay there for a week. That may seem excessive, but if it worked, it had to be long enough that there was no doubt it worked. I suppose I should explain. Time doesn't work the same way inside a null field. It seems normal in the field, but it's disconnected from outside. I could give you plenty of science and engineering jargon, but all you need to know is that no matter how long you spend inside the room, no time passes. I didn't account for all of the problems that could cause in my first attempt. I turned on the machine. It ran for about a half a second, then stopped. I tried it a dozen times, moved things, checked circuits, and then I saw the obvious problem. As you likely guessed because you weren't overthinking it, when the null field came on, the flow of electricity from outside of the field stopped. So I got a generator. That way the machine could run for as long as I had gasoline. There was an issue of the generator exhaust, but the field extended a few feet outside of the room. Once I had the generator, I performed the simplest experiment. I tossed a small rubber ball down the hallway, then flipped the switch next to the door. I then sat in the recliner and read the first 3 chapters of a book I had been wanting to get to for months. A few hours later, I opened the door, watched the ball hang in the air for a few seconds, and finally flipped the switch, and the ball bounced down the hall, proving that in those several hours the ball hadn't moved. According to my phone, I had to be at work in 2 hours. So I did the only logical thing. I went back inside the room, turned it on, and took a nap. I finished my book, watched several movies, and slept more than I had in years, all without any guilt of missing out. And I would have stayed longer, but I had spent most of my savings. So after another nap, I went to work. It was a long, boring day looking over research that I didn't care about. It was also one of the better days I had had in years. I didn't feel tired, and I had something to look forward to. I also knew that while I was scheduled back in about 16 hours, it would be far longer than that for me. I continued that for a good while, and it soon became clear that my lack of time was, in large part, a lack of money. Because even with the ability to stop the flow of time, I still had to go to work most days or run out of everything I needed to live. Still, I felt as if I had more time. I read books on self-improvement, now that the excuse of being too busy was gone. I also learned yoga and practiced self-defense. That led to the second more difficult side effect. Time stopped outside of the null field, but inside it was more complex and much harder to prove. Things don't age while in a null time field. I tested this how people had been testing things for decades. I got fruit flies since they only live about 10 days. I had kept them alive for a month before I let them go. As money became a bigger factor, I considered the possibilities of selling the discovery. It was the reason I had been researching it, and I had a few ideas. The easiest was a hotel. The rooms would be expensive, but you'd only need a few, because each person could spend as long as they wanted in the room and yet be out in only minutes. It wasn't the best use of the technology, but it was reasonably simple. Other ideas could change the world. I imagined factories inside null time having a full 8-hour day in the time it took for people to get into and out of the building. Perhaps even more useful would be letting scientists and doctors run experiments in days that would normally take years. And the more things I thought of, the more certain I was that I couldn't let the technology go into the wild. It was too much power. The first person who got the technology would literally have all the time in the world to use it before any of their competitors. But the problem was also the solution. I had all the time in the world to discover a way to share null time with the world. So I got a couple of notebooks and wrote my thoughts. If I had been smarter, I would have kept those locked away safely in the null time room. But by then, I had become obsessed, and every hour I was at work felt like a wasted hour pulled away from my life, so I decided to try to get some work done while I was there. That wouldn't have been a big deal, except my boss lived under the impression that if you're being paid by the company, you have no right to privacy. So he picked up the notebooks while I was at lunch, and by the time I got back, he had read through several of the leather-bound notebooks. His questions were an annoyance, but he had no reason to believe it was anything but an intellectual exercise. Still, his questions might have been more of a red flag had I remembered that they were happening much faster for him than me. So, while it felt like he was asking questions every week or so, it was actually every day. And when I was home in the null time field, it was as if he didn't exist. And in some strange way, he didn't, because while I could turn off the field and walk back into that world, until I did, it was almost as if the entire world didn't exist. My record for staying in the room was almost 3 months. It was lonely, but I was always a loner, and a good audiobook or a TV show can almost make up for being alone. But eventually, a few of the people noticed I was acting odd. Most of that was because of how difficult it is to keep track of the difference between null time and real time. So one day, I called my mother 6 times and apologized for how long it had been since I talked to her the last time, more than once. She took it as a joke, but it was still clear she was worried. The people at the grocery store probably found me odd as well. I didn't bother to visit different stores until I noticed the one closest to my house was almost entirely out of both rice and beans, because I had come into the place several times in the same couple of days. Then the worst happened. I can only assume that my boss had been asking other people questions, and those must have gotten back to Sci-Fi Inc., because one day, while I was carrying dozens of bags of food into the house, I saw 4 men with guns and matching suits approaching my house. Had I thought about it more carefully, I would have called 911 and slipped out the back, but my first reaction was to go to where I felt the safest, and that was the null time room. Once I was in the room with the null time field running, I had time to consider my situation, and I realized my mistake. There was only one way into the room, and looking down the hall, I could see a pale man with tattoos poking out of his short-sleeved shirt carrying a shotgun. I couldn't leave the room without being seen and likely shot, but I couldn't hide until they left, because time didn't pass outside of the room. So I used my one resource and sat and considered what to do. The first step was the most simple. I needed to limit how much time they had once I left the null field, so I dialed 911, then slid the phone across the wooden floor of the room toward the door in the hallway. It stopped as soon as it reached the doorway, so I flipped the switch next to the door. The phone slid on the smooth tile and into the bathroom, where, with any luck, the Sci-Fi Inc. team wouldn't find it. I then turned the field back on. That wasn't the solution, though. The police would take 5 minutes to get here, and it would only take them a few seconds to shoot me. I started by focusing myself. Fear had its uses, but it wouldn't make me think clearly. So I went through several exercise routines designed to help calm a person. I then went through one of the martial arts training videos. I didn't expect it to help. Even if I stayed here for years and trained every day, You don't become great with martial arts without someone to train with, and even the best martial artists wouldn't attack 4 well-trained and armed men if they had a choice. But taking time to think out everything helped calm me. After a day of thinking, I had an idea. If I threw something at the door, it would stop as soon as it hit the edge of the field. I could then throw out more. If I threw enough things at the door, some of them would hit the man at the end of the hallway. But while I might get lucky, I doubted it would badly hurt anyone or even slow them down much. Still, I didn't see much other choice. If I tried to cut through the wall and escape that way, I would break the wires in the wall, which made null time possible. And even if I didn't, once I was out of this room, they would chase me down. Mostly I sat and thought. I had been storing up extra supplies for months. If I rationed my food and recycled the water, I might survive a year. But at the end of that time, I'd be weak, and no time would have passed for them. So, instead, I decided to find out the answer to a few questions I had never had the courage to investigate. One of the most basic was what would happen if something or someone left the null time field while it was on. The most obvious version and least useful was what would happen if I stuck my arm out as far as I could. Would my hand freeze while the rest of me was still moving? If so, would it hurt? I still wasn't willing to take the test that far, but I was willing to test it with one of my curtain rods. I pulled it down and pushed it out into the hallway. It went about an inch into the hallway and then stopped. It hung in the air, and it was no easier to pull it back inside than it was to push it further. That was interesting, but it wasn't likely to do anything, so I got my tools out. The room wasn't big enough to have many, but I was, after a few hours, able to cut the curtain rod off about an inch inside the room. I then took out the hammer and tapped at the back of the rod. It didn't seem to have any effect, but I had a theory. So I continued to tap on and off over the next several days, until I was afraid that hitting it would cause the hammer to get stuck outside of null time. I then flipped the switch next to the door. Time outside the room restarted, and the man at the end of the hallway lifted his head, but before he had time to react, the 6-inch piece of metal shot down the hall like a bullet and smashed through the wall, sending splinters and pieces of plaster everywhere. It missed the gunman, and I flipped the switch, turning the null field back on, though the frozen, shocked look of horror on his face gave me some hope he might just leave. But I couldn't know without allowing more time to pass, and if he shot, he'd probably hit me. But at least I had a plan. Over the next few days, I removed all the curtains, replacing them with a few pieces of paper taped over the part of the window where the sun was. I then built a small barricade with anything I didn't think I would need. That way, if they shot into the room before I could turn the null field back on, there was less chance they would hit me. I then turned off the field. I was determined to wait as long as I could. The phone in the bathroom should still be calling 911. But I focused on the man who had seen the piece of metal explode against the wall. He backed away, and I could only assume he went to talk with his friends. I counted slowly while I waited, trying to keep track of time. It's difficult to know how much time had passed in the real world when turning the null field on and off, and I needed to know. I had counted to 73 before 2 of the men came into the hallway. Both were running as fast as they could with guns pointed at the doorway. I waited until they were fully in the hallway, then I turned the field back on. My timing was better than I had thought. I hadn't seen or heard the gunshot, but I could see a bullet hanging in the air halfway down the hallway. I focused on that first, taking pieces of metal and pointing them at the bullet, then pounding them into the air just outside the null field with the hammer. I didn't spend as much time on each as I had the first one, but I still took days hammering all of them into place, stopping from time to time to watch TV and relax. I had no way to judge how much pressure I was putting on them, but didn't want to kill anyone if I didn't have to. Uncertain if the things I was hammering into thin air would stop the bullet, I moved everything in my room away from where the bullet might hit, then, careful to be outside the door frame, I flipped the switch off, then almost immediately back on. Once I was certain that time outside the room had stopped again, I looked out into the hallway. It looked almost as if an explosion had gone off in the hallway. Pieces of metal had dug their way into the walls along the hallway and the wood floors, They had also slammed into the two men who were approaching me. Both men were on the ground, and while they were both injured, they didn't seem dead, though since they were frozen in time, it was hard to be certain. With no guns pointed in my direction, I turned the null field back on and counted slowly as their friends came into the hallway and dragged them back into my living room. I considered turning the field on and launching more pieces of metal at the group, but I decided to wait to see if they left. I also had some hope that the police might be on their way. But it was almost impossible for me to keep track of time. For me, it had been almost a week since those men had broken into my home. For the rest of the world, it had been minutes. With no one in the hallway, I couldn't see what was happening. So I counted to 100 and then flipped the switch so that time stopped outside of my room. I was exhausted, scared, tired, and needed to calm down, so I slumped into the recliner, turned on the DVD player, and watched sitcom episodes until I fell asleep. By the time I woke up, the DVD had ended. Nothing had changed. The sun was still in the same spot. The spot of blood in the hallway hadn't dried. I had grown used to things not changing. Having the sun sit in the same spot in the sky for days or weeks was disconcerting, but now there was something about that stability that made me feel safe. But for the first time since I was in the room, I felt pressed for time. I could run out of supplies if I wasn't careful. So I returned to the door and flipped the null field off and waited. I counted to 94 before the two remaining men appeared. They spread out more than before and shot as soon as they appeared. One bullet hit the barricade I had created, and another the wall, 3 inches from my head. I was lucky, and I flipped the switch. There were still 2 bullets in the air, but I was most interested in the 2 men since the bullets weren't all that dangerous. Since Sci-Fi Inc. had only sent 4 men, and I was certain the other 2 were injured, I decided to end this. So I went overboard. I spent almost a month pounding pieces of wood and metal into the air. I might have spent longer, but the gasoline I used to run my generator was running out. I finally ended by attaching the sheet from my bed to a few of the pieces that stuck out the most. By the time I was done, half of my room had been pulled apart. But it worked better than I could have hoped. A rain of wood and metal slammed into the men along with the sheet, dragging them and all the clutter down the hall. I watched them scramble out of the pile, battered and bloody but alive. With them running away, I left the machine off. The police showed up 5 minutes later, and I explained it was a home invasion. They asked several questions. I told them I had a shotgun in the back, and since it was my home and no one had been killed, all they did was take blood samples and park a car in front of my house to make sure no one came back. I then refilled the fuel in the generator and turned on the null field and sat for several minutes thinking about what had just happened. I then turned off the null field and called one of my friends and asked him over to work out a plan, but mostly I just invited him over because I had spent enough time alone. Author's note.
My first and best computer teacher once explained a programming axiom I believe fits in far more situations than simply programming. I later discovered that it was Parkinson's law. It states that a job will expand to fill the time allotted to it. In programming, that isn't always a bad thing. If you give a programmer an hour to make something, they'll get it done. Give them 10 hours and they'll improve the interface and add a few features. Give them a couple of days and they'll make it look good and might even work on optimization. It's been a while since I have done any programming, but I think that's more or less fair. But it's more than just the desire to make a program better, or laziness, as you work less quickly when you have more time. It also fits another one of my firmly held beliefs. For most of us, the issue isn't the time we have that affects things the most. It is our priorities. Because of that, more time isn't likely to change that much. We'll just give more time to that thing that we're already prioritizing. If that's our family, friends, and ourselves, that would be good. But if it's work, playing video games, or watching TV, then we might get a higher score, reach the next level, or finally get around to watching that TV series from 10 years ago, but fundamentally things are unlikely to change. This story was written a few years ago, and doesn't go as much into those ideas as it might. Instead, It is more of the fantasy of having time. But it does home in on another reason, that it's easy to feel rushed. I love to read, but if I sit and read a book, I still feel some of that nagging feeling that I'm missing out on other things even when I'm not. In the null time field, that simply isn't the case. I hope this story helped you to take a moment to free yourself from the fear of missing out and the relentless ticking of the clock. If you enjoyed it, you can subscribe to my newsletter at www.anscifi.com and get a free short story every week, or you can become a patron and get access to over 30 patron-exclusive stories and vote on the patron-exclusive story for each week. Thank you. Elton Gar.